Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the virtual listening session for the Recode LA project. We're putting up the presentation for this evening. In a moment, you're going to hear Lee and Tom as they go through the presentation. During the evening, please know that we cannot hear you. We can only hear Lee and Tom. If you have questions, and we hope that you do, because we've got a whole gaggle of staff who are ready to take your questions. So enjoy the evening, and thanks so much for being here. So let me just turn off my webcam. Boop. There you go.
Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This is one of the our listening sessions for the Recode LA project, which is a comprehensive rewrite of the City of Los Angeles' zoning code. We've held a series of listening sessions throughout the city, and this is our first one through the web. So thanks for joining. Thanks for registering. My name is Tom Rothman. I'm a senior planner with the Planning Department of Los Angeles, and I am project manager for the Recode project, and I'm joined with our prime consultant, Lee Einsweiler.
My name is Lee Einsweiler with Code Studio from Austin, Texas. We're the lead consultant on the project, and you'll see our team a little bit later in the show.
Right, and we're going to go through a presentation tonight. We're going to tell you a little bit about the project, why we're doing it, where it's going, and we're going to go through the process, and then we're going to turn it over to questions. We're going to get some questions online, and we're going to do our best to answer everybody and to get you up to speed on where we are and where we're going. So, Jenny, when you get a chance, let's start the show. And this is the first slide here talks a little bit about overall where we're going with the project. It's a 5-year program that will comprehensively rewrite the city's zoning code, and we have 3 main deliverables that we're promising in the next 5 years. First is a dynamic web-based zoning code, and that will provide users, stakeholders, neighborhood folks, developers with the ability to customize the zoning code specifically for them. It'll be, we're calling it like a concierge service, a TurboTax idea where you can type in the type of property you have and have the computer spit out exactly the regulations that pertain to that property, as opposed to the current system where you would have to go through several different sections of our zoning code to find out exactly what's required. The second deliverable is a layperson's guide to zoning. So instead of going through an entire document, this will be a cheat sheet, a comprehensive but abbreviated version of the zoning code. And lastly, a unified downtown development code. That is a downtown code, zoning code specifically for downtown Los Angeles because it's a unique and a uniquely charactered part of our city. So right now we have several sections of our zoning code devoted to downtown, but it's scattered throughout the code. We'd like to pull all those sections out and put them in one main place. So that's the third deliverable. We expect to have that downtown code delivered a little sooner than the 5-year program. We're looking at about 18 months to 2 years for a downtown code. And our project team is made up of city employees like myself, and here's the list. Alan Bell is our deputy director, myself, Eric Lopez, David Olivo, Deborah Cahan, Katie Peterson, and Daisy Moe, in addition to other staff from the department who are an invaluable assistance to this project. The next slide, history and background, and how do we get here? This is a little background on why we're working on this project and why it's so vital to development and planning in Los Angeles. So the story goes that in 1946, the scattered zoning ordinances that were in the municipal code were gathered together to form one book, and that was Chapter 1 of the municipal code, the zoning code. So that was the first time we comprehensively revised zoning in the city. And that book, if you go to the next slide, Jenny, actually one more. Thank you. That's the book on the left. That's our 1946 zoning code, and if anybody wants to come in and see it, it's on the 7th floor of City Hall. That book is the same format as we have today. That's the book on the far right, and the book in the middle is from 1978. So as you can see, we've been adding to it and adding to it, but the format is essentially the same. So when we started zoning in the city, we were planning for a 1946 Los Angeles, a very suburban greenfield type of city. Well, as we all know, that is no longer the case for the majority of the city. We are pretty built out, and we need a more progressive and a more modern zoning code. The next slide, Jim. Okay, so what are the current problems with that 1946 zoning code? Why are we here today? So, as I said, some of the basic set of zoning classifications are the same as the 1940s. So when we were planning for a suburban city, we created zoning classifications that accommodated that. That's not always what we need today. Some of them are still very valid and very useful. However, to make our city a little more progressive, we can't use those tools. We need more tools in our toolbox. The second point, scattered language results in vague, contradicting, and complicated regulations. Well, that's true. We've been adding to this code so often that it's gotten very complicated. We put too many Band-Aids on one book. We need to uncomplicate it. We need to separate out what's relevant, what's not relevant, and make it a little more streamlined and user-friendly. The third point, our city relies heavily on entitlements, site-specific conditions, and overlay districts. This has been created because our tools, we don't have enough tools, so we've created a system of overlay districts and additional zoning tools that put layer upon layer of zones on one or two properties. So it can be very complicated to understand what you can and cannot do with your property. It also makes it very difficult for neighborhood folks and stakeholders to understand what could go on in their neighborhoods. We want to cut through that and get down to the real zoning issues and what are the real zones that apply to a specific piece of property. And that's when you take under consideration all of these different layers and boil it down to one zone. And lastly, our old ways do not always promote good urban design for our transit-oriented progressive city. Jenny? Here's another big problem with our code. Because it's a little outdated, we have a part of our zoning code that's actually not in our zoning code. It's on shelving in our planning department on shelves just like this. This is an actual photograph of our shelf in City Hall, and these are interpretations of our zoning code when it's not, and they've been issued by our chief zoning administrator to clarify the uncertainties and to make site-specific judgments and cases. It's very complicated, and it's unless you know the right place to look, you're not getting a complete picture of all the zoning in the city. You need to understand what's in most of these documents, and part of this project is for us to cull through all of these documents, see what's important, and to codify it so that it's all in one book. This is obviously a very old-fashioned way of doing things. This is a really interesting slide. We have over 70 different entitlements, things like variances and conditional use permits. We have adjustments, slight modifications. We have a host of entitlements that are required when you build in specific plans, specific plan exceptions, adjustments, project permits, amendments. A lot of ways to deviate from the zoning code. We don't need that many. We need to look through this and cull it down. The reason we have so many is because they've been created piecemeal over the years. They all have different appeal routes. It's confusing. There's different notification periods. Sometimes there's no justification, just done at different times. Next slide. Here's an interesting map. This is the city, obviously, and the darker shaded areas are parts of the city that are covered by more than just our zoning code. So 60% of the city is covered by other zoning regulations. So as I said, we've created a series of overlay districts, specific plans, qualifying conditions, other development restrictions, T's and Q's and D's. So you can't just look in our one book anymore. You have to look in a series of documents to know what the zone is. This is not a very effective way of zoning our city. All of the tools should be in one place. And the majority of properties have two or more different sets of regulations, so you've got to juggle two or more books, and it can be very, very confusing. The next slide. And because of all of this confusion and overlap and underlapping, a lot of the department, this is a budget of our department, fairly recent budget, that because of all of these deviations people are required to get, developers are required, that 61% of our staff in the planning department, our very talented planners, are required to be case processors. They've got to review these specific plan exceptions, these general plan amendments, these zone changes, these specific plan adjustments, these tract maps, parcel maps, subdivisions, private streets. A lot of necessary things, but a lot of things that really could be boiled down and reduced. We'd like to have more than just 14% of our very talented planning staff dedicated to planning. We'll talk a little bit about our general plan framework and one of the main goals of the zoning code rewrite. Back in the 1990s, the city adopted a general plan framework element. That's one of the elements of our general plan. We have several chapters of that, of the general plan. We've got a housing element. We have a transportation element that we're revamping into our mobility element. We have a noise element, safety, a variety of elements. One of them is our framework, which is the overarching document to sort of connect all of these different aspects of our general plan. That was a very progressive document at the time. It really laid out the goals for a city that was really built out and going into more of a transit-centric mode. The problem is that general plan with a great vision doesn't have the backup document to support it. That sorry about that. Sorry about that. Got a little frozen there. As I was saying, so great visionary document, our general plan framework. We need a better toolbox. We need a better zoning code to implement that. So as the general plan framework talks about regional centers, transit-rich hubs, transit corridors, we don't necessarily have the right zones to put into our community plans to implement that general plan framework. And that's one of the main points of this zoning code rewrite, that we actually provide our planners in our community plan division to actually have the right amount of tools to fulfill the framework vision. And last is the zoning code has never revised to implement these policies and standards. So we have a very outdated code. We've been piecemealing, we've been adding to it, but it's not perfect, and we have a long way to go. And Jen? And what is the vision for a new zoning code? I'm going to turn this part of it over to our consultants, Lee Einsweiler. So I'm going to turn it over to him right now.
Thanks. So this slide helps you understand that it's not just our firm from Austin that's working on this. In fact, we have a variety of team members. We have legal and drafting support from Mark White of White & Smith out of Kansas City. Torty Gallus will be working with us from their Los Angeles office. Neil Payton's heading up that effort. Nori Winter of Winter & Company will be working with us on historic preservation and urban design issues. Lamphere Gregory out of the Bay Area will be working with us on sort of some of the California zoning issues and the EIR process. VPE Public Relations, located here in South Pasadena, will be working with us on public relations and communication with the general public. The Robert Group as well is helping us with public outreach. Peter Park, the former planning director from Denver, is helping us in regard to process and administration and staff capacity to employ this new code. Local architect John Kaliski is part of our team, local landscape architect Pat Smith. We're here in the offices right now of Urban Insight, the creators of Plan Netizen, an excellent source of planning news. They are doing the project website and the dynamic web-based code that you heard about earlier. Impact Sciences will be doing our environmental impact review, and Design Gnomes is helping us with graphic design. So we've got a full team here working with us. There also are some internal pieces of this, an internal technical advisory committee of the staff and the newly formed ZAC, as it was eventually named, the Zoning Advisory Committee, which is in the process of formation right this minute, that will be a sounding board for us as we go through this project. one of the things that we suggest when we talk about Code Studio and our work in other communities is that we have shown that we are capable of successfully managing one of these big city code projects. Not quite as big a city as Los Angeles, and in fact this is probably one of the largest projects that will ever be let to a private consultant. It will be a challenging one, but our firm has a proven track record of starting and finishing concept through adoption, major zoning codes like this project. This is a 5-year project overall. We're about a half a year in at this point. We've got 4.5 more years of work before we're finally done here. Next slide. Our firm has a reputation for innovation in coding, and in fact, one of our sort of watchwords when we talk about our firm is right rules in the right place. Venice is not Van Nuys, is not Los Feliz, is not the industrial portions of the community. And in thinking about all those different places, we've got to stop thinking that the same tool is the right answer for each of those places. And so when Tom suggested earlier that we need a broader toolkit, this is part of the thinking is really understanding those places throughout the city of Los Angeles and making sure that we have the tools in the toolkit available to the planners to implement the vision of the community. Vision is a key part of what we're talking about here. Their framework element itself and other pieces of the general plan and of each of the community plans are very visionary. And our task really is not to generate new vision. That's really not our role at all. It's really to code for the existing visions and to code a toolkit that can be used to implement future vision as well. We have in the past planned and designed great places. We are not designing any now, but the point of that is to say that members of the team have been heavily involved in the kinds of small area planning and other things that that really highlight those on-the-ground problems that need to be responded to by a citywide ordinance or by the downtown zoning ordinance. We also believe that part of our role here is successfully educating and facilitating. We, in the end, want community buy-in that this zoning code is a good new thing for the public. And we believe that that kind of educating and facilitating ensures a simplification of the adoption process. So we hope to be able to explain the complex concepts that are embodied in the current zoning in a much simpler way as we move forward with the new zoning code. We are known as a firm, and I think the entire industry is headed for a much more user-friendly and elegant kind of a document to regulate zoning. This is one of our codes being shown here. The pages are from actually Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a small area plan there. The challenge of codes is really to help people who might not be text-driven, who might be design-driven, right-brained, more creative, more visual thinkers, to understand those code regulations, as well as those who work with the text and the numbers and the pure things. So in providing both of those materials on the same page, you're really reaching all of the audiences necessary, and that will be very important in our new document. The community planning tools available now are constantly a challenge for the planners. So once a new community plan is completed, we find ourselves patching the existing zoning ordinance. The newest proposed patch is the CPIO, the Community Plan Implementation Overlays. These ideas that happen at the end of community plans are forcing us on a case-by-case basis across the 35 community plan areas across the city to actually build new tools, when in fact we probably could gain value from those tools in other settings as well. And so when we develop them only as part of the community planning operation, they're only available in one area. And we need to look through those community planning tools that have been developed over time and find the elements that we should be using community-wide. We need to be thinking much more about the integration of private property and the zoning regulations that occur there and the public realm, meaning the street and the sidewalks between the building faces. That public realm is becoming increasingly important to walkability, the health of this community, the sustainability of the city over the long run. And finally, clarity, and consistency of the new regulations will be very important. Right now, with all of the layers, it's certainly unclear and often inconsistent. Those community planning tools, again, need to be visually presented when we're done with them. Go ahead. And finally, the notion of actually delivering the code in a dynamic way to any device that you may have, whether it's a tablet, a phone, your desktop computer, or anything between. The extensive use of graphics, tables, and charts and being able to translate those into each of those formats requires a much more sophisticated code delivery system. And so we'll be working with Urban Insight in order to create a really intuitive way to compile the most relevant provisions for your particular property and deliver them up to you so that you have the majority of the rules that you need in a smaller, more bite-sized book than the full code book. The full code book's unnecessary to an industrial developer. He doesn't want to look necessarily at the sign provisions or the single-family residential provisions. If he's got a flat site, he doesn't care about the hillside provisions. So there are substantial portions of the code that do not apply to given properties. And this will be our way of thinking through which new provisions apply and how to deliver a smaller package of provisions to people. Next. Predictable and effective processes. So you saw the very large chart with 70 entitlement processes that you currently have today, and that has been shrunk down in recent history from a much larger number of processes that existed before that. So one consolidation has already happened, but clearly we believe that we can consolidate and provide a little more predictability and certainly more effectiveness in the code review processes for how development works its way through the system. This is not to suggest that we're taking citizens out of the process or public comment out of the process, but simply providing more consistency about how each of the processes might work in the future. Downtown revitalization is going to be one of the keys. It's happening already. It's happening in a somewhat unplanned way, which is why 2 of the community plans are coming back forward through the process right now. As those community plans are developed, we'll be working to develop a code that follows along right behind it, a specific code for downtown that provides for the new ideas for the new kind of downtown that is emerging today. Public participation is going to be a key to this entire process. We're excited that this many people have joined us as part of this virtual session. The notion of being able to reach people in their living rooms, in the local coffee shop, wherever we can, is very important to us. So we will have this zoning advisory committee as a sounding board. We will be extending the opportunity to participate in regional forums based on the 7 area planning commission boundaries. So 7 regionals, the traditional quarterly newsletters, et cetera, will continue to be part of the process as we move forward. So finally, one of the things that we'd like to suggest is that we think that codes have the potential to unlock the ability to achieve the vision of local plans, to help our clients, in this case the City of Los Angeles and its neighborhoods, think quite boldly about their options and how they can code in the future, provide greater certainty about outcomes, which helps neighbors and development community alike, try to level the playing field for the little guy. If you're just a small business, just a small property owner, you ought to have the same rights on getting through the process that the big guys have. Provide opportunities for investment and reinvestment in the city, ease the process of infilling neighborhoods, speed up the process of approving development, improve enforcement through the certainty of new regulations, and make it easier to adopt and implement future plans. A point being that we are really here as a team to help the city and code studies specifically code and implement those visions, not plan or create new policy, but really implement existing policy and achieve where the city has already suggested they would like to go. The final slide of our presentation really offers up some questions that we asked of people that were in the audience seeing this presentation in our formal face-to-face listening sessions. How could the existing code be improved? More graphics, flowcharts, tables? How about the procedures? Is it easy to understand how you get a project approved? What kinds of things are you seeing that have been built recently? Buildings or projects you like, ones you don't like, kind of the details of what you like and don't like about them. Are there projects in other communities, things you've seen built elsewhere that you'd like to see built in Los Angeles? Those are all ideas that you can begin to think about. But right now, we'll be glad to respond to specific questions that you might have. If you'll send those in, Jenny is going to moderate and send us some of those questions. And Tom and I are going to sort of tag team and try to answer some of those questions for you. So I'm going to let Tom answer one of the first questions, and we'll sort of switch back and forth here in responding to questions after that.
Hi, I see there's a question in here from Ian Sprague who's asking, how can I see the whole thing here? Will the Westlake Community Plan be included in the downtown specific portion of the new code? More generally, what will be the boundaries of the downtown area subject to its own code? Well, we traditionally have looked at downtown as being Central City and Central City North, and we're going to continue along that path, so Westlake will most likely not be included in the downtown code. That will continue to be a separate part of the city and will need to comply with the citywide code.
So we've also been asked a few questions that came in beforehand as you signed up. Many people included questions there. One of the interesting questions to me, and I'd perhaps like Tom to comment it after I've responded as well, how do we make LA more sustainable? Of course, that always depends on your definition of sustainability, but I think that there are some simple ideas, a variety of housing types, the ability to improve walking and biking and other alternative modes of transportation for people, the opportunity to live near transit or to live near work. All of those will be ideas that we'll be tracking at the large-scale level to implement the vision of the community plans as we work on new regulations. There may be other things the city is doing with sustainability that are worth mentioning here as well.
Certainly. We have a number of ordinances in place. Right now, we've adopted a new modified parking requirement district, which is being looked at to be implemented in 3 parts of the city, where we are going to have much more flexible parking standards. That's going to be that's currently in our code, but it will be transferred into a new code. We also have adopted Cal Green building codes for the city. That will continue to go on. And also, as our new code gets developed, we're going to have a variety of new zones that can be used around transit to incentivize better walkability, better pedestrian-friendly buildings, and create a climate where the city is not so car dependent. So I think that's a big part of it.
So one of the other submitted previously questions was how could the new zoning code help with code enforcement questions, the sort of no enforcement or selective enforcement that the question asker sees as going on today in Los Angeles. And I'd like to suggest that, of course, code enforcement is a manpower problem. Effective code enforcement means you've got to have personnel out on the street. So number one, the zoning code can't fix the fact that we don't have enough people in code enforcement. But what it can do, what it can hope to do, is by providing a clearer code, reducing some of those layers, it can make each investigation, each question about whether something's legal or not legal, much easier to answer. And therefore, the capacity of the staff that we do have to enforce existing codes may improve. And the ability of people, regular people within neighborhoods, to understand what's allowed and not allowed may improve. And therefore, code enforcement sort of at that most local neighborhood-driven level may actually improve. So we're hopeful that that's one of the things that the new code might help with.
Right, and as Lee was saying, because we've created all these multiple layers of zoning, it's complicated for staff people as well as neighborhood folks, and for developers. It's complicated for planners who actually are creating these laws. Sometimes they're not always lining up. It's very difficult for our building and enforcement agencies to know what the rules are. It makes it complicated. Enforcement will be better when there's one document and when one set of rules apply.
So one of the other prior questions, I think also a very good one. What happens to the existing community plans? What happens to the existing specific plans? How are they dealt with in the new zoning code? So a couple of things. Community plans, at their best, will exist without zoning-like standards in them. They provide vision and policy about how a community should build out, and they cover a large-scale area. So those community plans will continue to drive zoning policy in the 35 community plan areas of Los Angeles. Specific plans are more of a hybrid of planning and zoning together. The specific plans will continue to exist after the new zoning code is in place, but they will each be reviewed, and many of the ideas of those specific plans may well be carried over into the full zoning code. Specific plans turn out to be a very good pilot testing ground for new ideas. And so it could well be that recent plans are a great opportunity for us to learn about what some of the new code provisions might be. So I guess I simply want to reassure the public that both the implementation of existing community plans and the opportunity to continue on with existing specific plans will be retained in the new code. But the long-term hope, of course, is that a better toolkit will mean that we need less specific plans in the future because we have better tools to implement the community plans themselves.
I just want to answer one more question before we jump back to the current scroll here. One of the questions we had previously received was, how are we progressing with the process and the community involvement for this project? We're about 6 months into the project. We have held 4 focus groups with different stakeholders. We've also been to 5 listening sessions. We've had, in addition to this 6th listening session right now, we've had over 500 people participate, an incredible amount of people, and they've already signed up to receive regular emails from our website. So please, again, if you haven't already, which I'm sure most people have done, sign up on our website, recode.la. And we're going to continue to do as much outreach as possible. Our next set of regional forums will be coming up late winter, early spring.
So one of the questions sent in by Alex Hirsch was, what specifically are you looking at implementing with the new code that will enhance walkability, bikeability, and transit access? I think there's some very simple things. The new mobility plan, which will be a policy element of the general plan, is going to include substantial improvements to the way that the city looks at walkability, bikeability, and transit access altogether, and is going to provide us a new policy forum in which to bring those issues up. That means, for example, at its very simplest, new street cross sections, which suggest how wide a sidewalk should be, what a bike lane should look like, where it's located within the street. Is it buffered? Is it not buffered? When should it be buffered and not buffered? Transit access, questions about how does one access a metro stop from a street through a development. Some of those kinds of things can be coded for, and sort of best practices from previous experiences in this community and other communities across the country, or in fact around the world, will be appropriate to consider. So many of those ideas will find their way into the new zoning code. We will also be working with the other internal departments, Public Works and other departments internal to the city, to get a consistent answer about how those things happen so that they can be coded successfully. And even that consistent internal answer may well be helpful to people before the code moves forward.
Another question we received was, what are the primary goals of creating a new code? Is it smart urban density, better building design, favoring transit corridors? I guess the answer is all of the above. We want a code that will, as I said earlier, complement our city's general plan framework, which sets policy on all of these ideas. We have citywide design guidelines right now. We have a lot of these policies in place. We need better tools, we need different zones, and we need a more comprehensive place to keep all these tools, and this new zoning code is the main way to do it.
So one of the other questions from Alex Mina was, will the new code address land use issues regionally rather than comprehensively? That's an interesting question, but it's perhaps a planning question. Will there be regional development standards that apply differently in an equine keeping area than in downtown? Yes, clearly. That exists today. But today's model, for example, the C2 zone shows up as the implementing district on most of the business corridors within the entire city, stretching from just outside downtown all the way through the valley, all the way down to San Pedro. It shows up in lots and lots of places. But that C2 zone is not just the C2 zone. It's been layered on with pedestrian overlay districts or Q's and T's and D's. It's been layered on with specific plans. And so C2 in each place really has a special flavor today. And one of the things that we'll be looking to do is to try to cure this problem of the overlays and the difficulty in understanding those layers by compressing all of the ideas down into a new base district which perhaps acts differently in a different part of the city. So C2 may come in a variety of flavors in the future, and hopefully each one appropriate to its community plan area.
Another question we received earlier was, how will this new recode project address existing incompatible neighboring land uses? One thing that the new ordinances do, they generally grandfather existing land uses in. However, so if there's an incompatible land use that's there, people will not have to change their property to comply with the new zoning code. Again, we are not going to be rezoning the city. We're going to be providing different tools to implement. So there will not be something to address current incompatible land uses. But hopefully in the future, with a new and improved zoning code, that will not be a problem in the future.
There are some ideas which might have impacts as uses change in existing corridors, for example. We might implement new buffers, perhaps new screening, controls on the spacing of uses up and down a corridor, hours of operation. All of those ideas that might well have come up in a specific plan, for example, are fair game for consideration to be applied citywide if they're good ways to ameliorate the impacts of a given use on its immediate neighbors.
We just received another question from Chris Roche. His question is, how will the new code offer more certainty to investors and developers by making the entitlement process more transparent? Also, how will the code be structured to adopt progressing urban theory in a less layered fashion? Okay, well that's a meaty question there. Take the first part here. It's how will the new code offer more certainty to investors and developers by making the entitlement process more transparent? Well, I don't think there's a current problem with our current entitlements being transparent. Most of our entitlements and discretionary actions are discretionary, so there's really nothing to be transparent about. They're really a determination that's made by a decision maker about whether or not a project should go forward or not. Those types of entitlements and reviews will continue. We hope to have far fewer of them, because what we hope to achieve by a new zoning code is to have more by right development that will comply with a more progressive zoning code and a more adaptable one. The second part is also, how will the code be structured to adopt progressive urban theories in a less layered fashion? Lee, you might want to take that one.
So I guess as much as anything, one of the things that it becomes possible, because we're headed into a world in which the code will be virtual, just like this listening session, the notion of having the big 500-page book sitting on your desk will be one probably reserved for the lawyers and others who just can't resist that paper copy. The new digital code will offer you a paradigm in which, as theory changes, as you bring forward a given project, you get a much smaller bite at the total code and a much more understandable one, we hope. So in that sense, we hope to be able to provide for some interesting things. The notion of changing urban theory over time is a fascinating one. You know, in the 1960s with urban renewal, we tore it all down, and then we regretted tearing it all down, and we wish we could build it all back up again. So planners do have a somewhat checkered history of grand theory as it is put into application. I think if the bones of the new code, meaning the organizational outline, the approach to regulating use, the way the development standards are laid out, if that is logical and practical, then bringing new ideas into play within that framework becomes much simpler. If we go back to where we were at in 1946 and we were just adding to that, it would be a whole lot easier than having to peel back all of the layers of where we are today. We are challenged, of course, to provide people with the same or improved rights beyond those which they have today in developing this new code. And so we'll be peeling back those layers very carefully as we move forward.
This is the last one we have here. It's about Virginia county governments.
It's probably not a great one. No. That project was for the Transportation Agency, and may not be a great one to describe. So Jack Lindblad will perhaps answer your question offline about Virginia county governments. I would like to share a pair of questions that came in beforehand that sort of illustrate the challenge of this project as it moves forward. The first of those was, what efforts or plans are underway, if any, to preserve industrial zoned land for job-generating activity? And as a companion to that came a second question, which was, what considerations are given to bringing mixed use to historic industrialized areas now abandoned near underserved communities? So the notion that in some cases industrial is achieving abandonment and yet we want to create job generation at the same time, those are competing notions which are resolved outside of this project. They're resolved in a planning process like a community plan. They're resolved in larger plan elements of the general plan. And this zoning process, in the end, won't really resolve those. On the other hand, if a community plan provides guidance and says, this portion of industrial zoning is meant to be saved, and over here, this portion of industrial zoning, we'd like to see transformed over time and become something new, those are pieces that the code can implement. And there should be tools in the toolkit to do either of those, to either ensure that industrial areas continue to be available and aren't priced out or pushed out by adjacent uses, and on the flip side, to ensure that large-scale sites made available as outmoded industrial comes out of play are available for whole mixed-use thinking and new mixed-use ventures adjacent to existing neighborhoods. So both of those ideas will have to exist in the new code.
We have another question that came in. Can we ensure FAR, floor area ratio minimums in certain areas? And can we also ensure parking maximums? And the answer is definitely on both of those issues. As far as the parking maximums go, we do have, as I mentioned earlier, this new modified parking requirement district. One of the 7 options to provide more flexible parking in these specific plan areas would be to provide parking maximums, which means that developers cannot put in more than the required parking, as opposed to our current method of providing minimum parking requirements that set a minimum standards, and of course you can provide as much as you want above that. As far as the ensuring FAR minimums in certain areas, that is something we are looking at right now on a separate project regarding downtown and minimum floor area ratios to encourage a minimum size for buildings.
So a related question that came in earlier was, will housing density be increased at TOD sites? Again, this is a sort of fascinating question. The community plan or a much more detailed plan that might be done as part of a transit project may include recommendations for new zoning to be applied. But in the meantime, the existing density there is something that would likely remain in place. And in this case, we're really not talking about density because for the most part, Los Angeles' zoning code does not include density, but the existing scale and bulk and mass of buildings would remain the same based on the allocation of height and the allocation of floor area ratio, which are the two primary tools we use to shape form in those kinds of places. Those would remain fundamentally the same, and if there are recommendations, of course, the toolkit, the new zoning code, should have options for more intensity if a community desires more intensity at a specific site, whether it's TOD or not.
Another question is, what changes are planned for the alcohol permitting process? The answer is nothing at the moment. That is one of our most common conditional use permits that we see in the planning department, and one of our most common cases that we see are conditional uses for the sale of alcohol and beer and wine. We do see a lot of those. It would be helpful to somehow maybe bundle these types of cases together, but right now there is no plan for the new code to streamline that at all.
So one of the other questions asked previously was, how are the new changes going to include the homeless and those in need of extremely low income affordable housing? Again, public policy has to be provided on those issues. And frankly, from the zoning code's perspective, typically housing for the homeless or for extremely low-income people needs an injection of cash from somewhere to make it happen, because it cannot happen at market rates. And so the zoning code doesn't it doesn't change the financing equation for how a project is developed. And in that sense, the changes to the code won't really enable that to be any easier or make it any harder than it is today. It may well become easier if the review processes for the building that might be developed become easier. That's the one way in which those projects could move forward through the system more swiftly. But without changes to the review process, presumptively, there are no additional things that the new zoning code will do on behalf of the homeless or the extremely low-income community.
We have a question here. What kind of incentives could be offered to support public art? That's a really good question. Right now we do coordinate with the Department of Cultural Affairs, and lots of our projects have a surcharge that's charged to them for public art. That's a current project. That's a current process that's in place. And I did want to mention that just recently the City Council did approve a mural ordinance that now allows murals after a 12-year ban to be put up all over the city in all zones. So that's one way, and our current zoning code will continue that process. But I think that's a really important part to explore other ways that we can support public art and community gardens.
So again, one of the broader questions that's been asked, how will the code enable or incentivize the city's built environment to change with innovative design solutions? So how do we make things happen? Well, fundamentally, it's important to realize zoning doesn't make things happen. Property owners and those involved in the development process actually make things happen. But the zoning can be enabling of new development that achieves the community's vision. And it can also make it difficult to achieve anything that doesn't match the community's vision. The most important thing that we'll be looking for are barriers to good development, to best practices, to innovative practices. Some of those barriers today might surround things like innovative stormwater solutions, the ability to provide permeable materials as part of your paving on a project, the ability to include your stormwater in the street adjacent to your development. Some of those kinds of ideas are a challenge today in this community and could be part of the codification of new ideas as we move forward.
Question here. I'd like to hear about how the simplified zoning code will still address the diversity in neighborhoods of Los Angeles. That's a great question. The point of the new zoning code is not to zone the city uniformly or to create one type of urban design standard. It's really going to provide ways of honoring and preserving the characters of specific neighborhoods. So there shouldn't be any misconceptions that this zoning code is going to make all development look the same. It's really a way of creating more flexibility in zoning to preserve what we already have and to encourage it.
And the starting point for the project in considering that is to look at all of the tools that have been used in all their variety across the city for the last 60 years, really, since the code was originally implemented. Each of the overlays, all the kinds of specific plans, all the other kinds of regulatory tools that have been put in place, and to try to figure out how many flavors are really needed across the city. How many different kinds of places do we really have? Once we can answer that question, then we should be able to provide the right palette of zones in the new zoning code, the right kinds of dimensional standards, the right kinds of sign controls, all of those things that can be calibrated to each community.
How does the Watts community fit into this plan? As we've said a couple times, that we are not going to be rezoning any neighborhoods or any communities. Watts is a neighborhood in our southeast Los Angeles community plan, and actually that plan is currently being reviewed for a community plan update. However, that is a separate process. In the future, the new zones that are being implemented with that update are currently using the existing zoning code, but the next time it gets updated, hopefully there will be a new zoning code with a more prolific set of zones for them to use, but this will not change any community plan or any specific plan.
So again, another very broad question asked by someone as they were signing up. How do we get a holistic view of infrastructure improvements to match development instead of patching afterwards? This is an intriguing question. Again, infrastructure and matching it to development intensity is a planning challenge and should be met in the community plans, in the general plan and its framework plan at very high levels, 30,000 feet as we describe it when we talk about this. Zoning is happening down at a level below that, and only where the larger scale plans have not accommodated the kinds of intensity that were anticipated in the plans do we run into a problem, and therefore have to ask the development community to step in and provide those patches. That happens most frequently during the rezoning process. So when land is being rezoned from sort of what we always expected it to be to a whole new idea, that's when we find ourselves with infrastructure gaps. Those are typically resolved by conditioning that zoning in order to provide for that infrastructure. That is a piecemeal approach, but it also provides great flexibility for the community in regard to matching new intensity, which can be approved by the City Council, to new infrastructure, which would be provided by the developer. So I think our standard planning process is still the best answer for providing infrastructure improvements that are a solid match to development. But that planning process ends at a certain point, and zoning kicks in, and really that's where this project will move forward. You cannot expect infrastructure planning to happen through the zoning code process.
One question we have is runoff control is important. How can we capture or mitigate stormwater? That's not really a zoning question or a planning question, but The city does have in place a stormwater urban runoff program through the Bureau of Sanitation. Sorry about that. As I was saying, there's a program called SUSUMP, S-U-S-M-P, that is implemented by the Bureau of Sanitation. And for new projects that rise to a certain level, they must capture a certain amount of runoff on site. So that's an ongoing policy and program that gets updated every once in a while, and it complies to the state's quality environmental laws. So that is in place. It will not be implemented or probably mentioned even in our zoning code, but that is a citywide program.
So one of the other larger questions was, how will the code potentially address multifamily development, especially in regards to density and parking requirements? Well, there's probably not one simple answer for that. Many people have suggested in the past that we provide improved multifamily design standards about the quality of multifamily development, and that we make sure that multifamily projects park themselves appropriately depending on the portion of the community they're in. The idea of differential standards for parking is probably important in handling multifamily, where you're providing multifamily above commercial in a transit-oriented development right adjacent to a metro station. That parking should be reduced beyond that might be provided in an area further afield in the community that has access only perhaps to a bus corridor, which might be a quarter mile away, in which case, in many instances, we would require the full parking standard to be met on site so that the multifamily parking does not spill out into the adjacent neighborhood. So there's very little doubt that we'll be looking at parking. Density for multifamily is really set today by the combination of the height requirements, the floor area ratio requirements, and the parking requirements themselves, which shape the size of the building. And so today's multifamily projects are generated by those three numbers, which are provided for every piece of property across the entire city. Will those be revisited? Well, perhaps in order to implement some of the goals in existing plans and achieve some of the vision in existing plans, they will. But in specific plans, they will not change. And for the most part, those in areas not transit served are, those parking standards in areas not transit served are unlikely to change.
We just received a question from Matthew Gamboa. His question is, what kind of role do you anticipate the LA River having in the new code? Well, a very important one. The Planning Department was very much a part of the Los Angeles River Revitalization Master Plan. That's a document that's out there right now to be reviewed. And we have a River Improvement Overlay District that's currently being reviewed and going through the process for adoption, which does set guidelines and design standards for properties that adjoin or abut the LA River. So that's a very important project for the Planning Department. Also, as our community plans get updated, I believe about 12 of them that are adjacent to the river, they are looking at the master plan to make sure that components of the master plan are integrated into those community plans. So we will be seeing progress on the community plan front as the projects of the river heighten up and the pace of them accelerates. So we are working very closely with all other departments, with the Bureau of Engineering, the Army Corps of Engineers, to make sure that we are synchronized with the planning efforts of the city and the federal and the state and the county governments.
So an intriguing question that was posed before our presentation. I'd like to hear about how a simplified zoning code will still address the diversity in neighborhoods of Los Angeles. I think key to the answer to this is that the code can provide a variety of options for implementation of community plans. And that's really what we're looking to do, is provide for those options. Those options, once you have selected one, should be clear simple, well illustrated, and understandable both by staff, neighbors, and applicants. So in that sense, the code itself may be large and therefore seem complex, but once you've clicked on your piece of property and linked away to that portion of the code that applies to you, we hope that actually it will be user-friendly, simple, easier to understand.
When do you estimate the housing portion of the code will be updated, and in what capacity will the housing department be involved? Well, there won't be an actual housing component of our new zoning code. As I said earlier, we do have a framework and a general plan that is required by the state for every charter city, and one of the elements of that, the general plan, is our housing element, which is currently going through the process right now, and that's the long-range plans for how we see housing being developed, what types of affordable housing are there, other types of housing options. So that is a separate process from the zoning process, and that's going on right now. So if you're interested in the policies regarding housing in the city, you should contact Matthew Glesney at the planning department to find out what specifically you can do to be more involved in that process. I know it was just brought to our Planning and Land Use Management Committee this week, and I'm sure there will be several more hearings on that as the months go by. So please get more involved in that very important project.
So one of the questions is, will the new code use performance criteria rather than prescriptive requirements for entitlement of new projects? It's a very interesting question, maybe a little bit wonky, but we don't mind that a bit. So performance standards are usually ways of simply saying to someone, you need to achieve this level. We're not going to tell you how to do it, but this is the way we're going to measure it. An example of that might be an output of light on a property. No more glare at the edge of your property line than half a foot candle. It's something we can take a light meter out and measure whether you're meeting or not, and allow you to light your property as you see fit with the types and kinds of fixtures that you'd like. As opposed to a prescriptive standard, which is typically simpler for many people to understand, because it would say something like, you shall light your parking lot with full cutoff fixtures no more than 30 feet tall, and they shall be shoebox style fixtures with one of the following 4 types of elements, this, that, and the other thing. Those kinds of prescriptive standards that tell you exactly what to do are simple for the applicant. They may be painful because they do not meet the applicant's design vision for what their site should look like, but they can be quite simple. Have we decided on how this new zoning code will fall in the performance versus prescriptive realm? No, we have no idea where the new code may fall. That's part of why we're gleaning through all of the other things that have been done in the past here to really find the best practices, the things that seem to be working. It seems that the development community, the neighborhoods, and everybody can agree are best practices. We'll be looking for those best practices and using them no matter what style they are, and we may well find ourselves mixing and matching those styles.
I want to go back to the previous question about housing, but I didn't finish that answer. It's how can the housing department be more involved? We will be, in addition to our zoning advisory committee that we'll be setting up, we will also be setting up a technical advisory committee that will be comprised of city departments. And of course, the housing department will be very involved in that process, along with other relevant departments that have a role with zoning in the city, such as the Department of Transportation, Building and Safety, Public Works, and other departments.
So there's a simple question for us to answer here. How soon will these plans be put into action? So the new zoning code for the downtown will be coming along first. That new zoning code we have promised within 30 months of the initiation of the project. So in about a year's time, some draft information will be ready on the new zoning code. But we will not stop work on the citywide questions during that time period. In fact, we're looking for some quick wins, some kinds of things that we can do relatively straightforwardly that will help the remainder of the community and become a part of the citywide zoning code. In the end, the entire project must be complete within 5 years. So both the downtown code and the citywide code will be completed and we hope adopted within that 5-year period.
I want to make sure checks and balances are in place and that this is not going to be a giveaway to developers. Well, this will ensure, hopefully a new zoning code will ensure a much more responsive development in the city, so you will know what can and cannot be built. There will be no shortcuts for deviations from the zoning code. Hopefully it will be a little more challenging to deviate from a code where it's very prescriptive and very clear. So we don't anticipate our level of discretionary entitlements to increase. So neighbors will really know what to expect, and developers will also know what to expect.
So Mark Glassick provided us an interesting question. What can the zoning code do to better facilitate community benefiting interim uses and innovative projects on vacant and abandoned land in many different zones? In fact, coming from Austin, Texas, I will tell you that we've come up with some fairly creative ways to ensure that community gardens are an option, that in our case food trailers are an option, that there are some ideas that let people make use of land until the time comes when more complete development is of greater interest. The sort of pop-up movement of providing short-term uses, even in existing buildings or on vacant lots, that let you experiment with a new business without fully committing before you see whether it'll work out, are a great way to activate street edges. So what can the new zoning code do to allow for those ideas? Well, it can certainly make the process of getting a permit to do those kinds of things a very straightforward thing. We will have to look for those kinds of health and public safety questions that one always looks at when one reviews and permits a use, but it is quite possible that we can make it easier to have a permitting process for certain kinds of things that meet the community's goals within each different part of the city. So it seems as though process is probably one of the best things that we can do and offer up for those kinds of interim projects.
We just got a question in from Jeff Liu, who's asking, continuing off the question on preserving diversity of our neighborhoods, how can communities like Little Tokyo and Chinatown use a community plan to preserve the culture of the neighborhood besides design guidelines, for example, that are where there are additional protections and review by these communities regarding future development? So how can smaller communities take advantage of a community plan? Well, I would recommend you to really take part in the community plan updates. So I know that these are actually neighborhoods that are going to be in the Central City and Central City North community plans. You might want to speak to Patricia Diefendorfer or Nick Marisich or Brian Eck of the planning department to talk about what the future they see for these neighborhoods and how you can play a much more robust role in ensuring their protections. And hopefully we'll have a much more complete zoning code.
So I think one of the key things that people can do during the planning process is help the planners who are engaged in that define the things that are important to the community. So is this a question of kinds of institutions that perhaps those planners don't understand how they operate, how things function, how they're traditionally have had signage, how frequently they're used, all kinds of things like that that can help the planners working with the community really understand what kinds of rules might turn out to be barriers or counterproductive to have in place, and what kinds of rules might actually be protection mechanisms. So really making certain that the culture is explained and the key portions of the physical elements of that culture are explained to the planners involved in the community planning process will help us ensure that the zoning code can do a better job of implementing those plans once policy has been set. One of the questions that we had just gotten was the region needs more green. And the fascinating thing about that is sort of an open question about what do you mean by more green. In many ways, the region could use improved streetscaping. That will come from the new mobility plan and the construction of new cross sections. It'll come from the mayor's new initiative, perhaps on great streets. The greening of the streetscape may well come from a variety of places. But if by green we meant energy conservation, then the California Energy Code and whatever local amendments we might do to it that apply ensure that kind of greening. If we meant the kinds of things like pocket parks within multifamily developments, or an area to escape to have a quick smoke break from your office somewhere, all of those kinds of providing more green, many of those ideas may well have been embodied in various zoning districts that have been created or in some of the overlays, etc. And we'll be trying to bring forward those ideas in a more comprehensive fashion in the new zoning code. So there is a hope that we'll be providing for more green. One final piece of green would be stormwater management. And as Tom described earlier, that element is really going to become a key part, I think, of the way that people think about sites in the future. But it is a link from the zoning code, but not a set of regulations in the zoning code itself.
Well, I've run out of questions that are pertaining to the planning department, so I'm eagerly watching our scroll screen here to hopefully get a few more questions. So feel free. We've got plenty of time left. Feel free to ask us things that you may not think are relevant, but we can answer questions. If you've got general questions about the planning department also, we can spend a few minutes answering those. I see one question just came in from Albert Mass, who says, Ventura Boulevard is getting very congested due to mixed-use development along the boulevard and nearby large apartment buildings. Will the new code address the effect of zoning on traffic congestion? The new code will provide more flexible zoning. It will not exactly address specific traffic congestion issues. That is really something for the Department of Transportation, but we will be looking at parking standards, and those could be a little more flexible. We could get into a much more comprehensive discussion on providing parking and how that generates traffic and pricing. So that's a much larger conversation than what we're discussing right now, but we are experiencing traffic all over the city, as we all know, and our ideas about free parking that are provided everywhere, amply to everyone, is something that we really need to address citywide. And well-taken question. Another question just came in from Joan Stewart. Will you be coordinating with the LA County Zoning and Planning? And most definitely. We will be talking to them. We work with them fairly frequently. They already have a new zoning code in place. We are going to be working with them to hear what they have, what their successes and their pitfalls may have been, but they will be very much involved in the technical advisory committee, and we do want to work with them to see where our city meets the county border, how we can create a more seamless transition.
So one of the questions just asked was what's next in this process: more public meetings, implementation of concrete steps, etc. So our team is at work in the background preparing two documents which will come forward together for public consideration and eventually CPC and council consideration. Those will be an evaluation of the existing zoning code and a code approach for the new code that describes where we're headed with the new code. So the very next steps are for us to finish producing that document internally, working with the planning staff, to present it to our zoning advisory committee, who serves as our sounding board, revise it if necessary, and then it will be brought out to the public through the series of 7 regional forums that come out through the Area Planning Commission areas. Those 7 forums right this moment are targeted to happen as part of a joint effort with the health and wellness chapter, as well as the mobility chapter of the general plan. So these 3 ideas will come out together at the same time, and that will probably be in March. We'll be holding a series of joint workshops. They'll be available both in the evening and on Saturdays. If we're successful, as we seem to be with our virtual session, we'll run a virtual session as well again, so that people can look at and hear about the approach and the problems with the existing regulations in a much more comprehensive way. Once that has been discussed in the community and people have had a chance to talk about it a little bit, we will be taking that proposed approach forward to the City Planning Commission and then on to the Plum Committee of Council and eventually potentially through Council itself for direction so that we can begin drafting. We'll begin drafting with any of those things identified for the citywide code that are sort of quick fixes, but primarily we'll begin drafting on the downtown code in response to the Central City North plans. We'll be implementing those plans initially with new zoning recommendations.
Got a question from, we'll go back up, okay. From another one from Jeff Liu, second question from Jeff. He's asking, considering the increase in baby boomers retiring, will the new zoning code consider flexible R1 zones to accommodate granny flats, those that increase density in traditionally single-family zoned areas? Jeff, we already do allow granny flats in our R1 zones. It was a state law, Assembly Bill 1866, that was passed, I would say, back in 2006, 2007. We did try to come up with our own ordinance. We never got that through, but we do comply specifically with state law. And if you can recall the slide in our slideshow of that very crowded, messy shelf, one of those pieces of paper in there is, yeah, Jenny, can you find that? It's in there. There it is. So I'm going to guess the bottom folder, second from the left, will contain that ZA memo that says that we will comply with state laws that says that all single-family zone lots are allowed to have second dwelling units on it with a series of specific requirements, that there must be spacing requirements, they must comply to setbacks, they must have additional parking, but we do allow them right now.
And I think that the simple answer is the new zoning code will move those regulations from the shelf into the book. And that's kind of the key here. We'll also illustrate the concept so that more people hopefully will see and be perhaps intrigued by the notion of what they might be able to do with their property.
From David Garfinkel. Hi, David. How do you see the Zoning Advisory Committee interacting with the department and consultant in the development of the new zoning code? We see it as almost one and the same. The section that I work in, the code studies, and our consultant team, we will be working very closely. We will be giving the ZAC, the Zoning Advisory Committee, presentations. We're not sure exactly how many times they're going to meet. We're looking at maybe two times a month, maybe more and sometimes, maybe less in other occasions, but we will be briefing them regularly, keep them up to speed on our latest developments. So we're going to be one and the same for a while.
So from the consultant team's perspective, the ZAC is a sounding board. We provide them the initial drafts once they've made it through sort of a staff review for red flags, and they get to look at that material first and foremost. And they hopefully represent the community in some fashion, all of the kinds of people that we might encounter, the development community, the environmental community, the bike activist community, the residential neighborhoods. They are intended to represent the entire city in that regard and give us an early sample of whether we have right-sized things for Los Angeles or not. Are we on the right track? That's kind of the question that we'll constantly be asking with them. And we look forward to them serving that function. A round of edits will be done after each time we meet with them, if necessary, if we happen to be on the wrong track. So there are first and foremost early warning system beyond the staff and before we get to the general public.
This one? Oh, okay. A question from Robert Nesbitt. He's asking, will the new zoning code address the lack of sufficient parks in residential areas? This is a challenge we face all the time in the planning department. How can we increase our severe lack of open space throughout the city? We're really not sure how our new code will address parks, but we will be looking at our Quimby requirements, hopefully expanding the ability to use our Quimby funds more appropriately throughout the city, maybe expanding where those funds can be used, not just within a half-mile or a quarter-mile radius, but maybe extending them all the way to the river. Those are some ideas being passed around. So we will be looking at that actually a lot sooner than the completion of this